Humans impact the environment in many ways. We have altered the world more than any other living species, changing large areas of land into unrecognizable spaces for cities, highways, industries, and agriculture. In recent history, pollution, microplastics, climate change, and many other challenges have presented themselves because of how human civilizations function. Since the Industrial Revolution, atmospheric gases like carbon, nitrous oxide, methane, and fluorocarbons have been increasing. This layer of gas is trapping some of the warmth from leaving the Earth, and this causes changes in our climate. Food is one of our basic survival needs. In recent years, humans have become a little disconnected from their food. Most of us buy our food from grocery stores, and we don't really know where it comes from or how it was grown. A lot of our staple crops, like soy, corn, canola, and wheat, are grown in large farm operations, instead of on small, local farms or in backyards. These large crops are used to feed humans, feed animals, and make biofuel, as well as other industrial products. Which brings us to industrial agriculture. Between rows and crop plants, we find bare soil. Bare soil is really unstable. It loses water easily, runs off with rain or wind, and heats really fast. Have you often seen bare soil in nature? Probably not, because it doesn't work. Roots help hold the soil together. Plants cover it and protect it. Soil is alive and needs to be part of an ecosystem to thrive, just like any animal or plant. Did you know soil needs air? Soil is actually composed of 20 to 30% air. Without air, things get dangerous. In low oxygen, it is more likely for bad soil organisms to take over. There just isn't enough good soil life to balance it out because they need oxygen like us to live. Notice when you see pathways where many people walk. The dirt is bare, hard, and with little or no plants. All those stomping human feet over days and weeks and even years change the soil and push it down, allowing little air to flow. And remember what happens when we don't have enough air? Things get unbalanced, and the soil life pays the price. Bad organisms that may not cause issues in small amounts can take over and cause problems. Now, let's think on a larger scale. Now, instead of feet, imagine large machinery in fields for tilling, planting, spraying, watering, harvesting crops, etc. What happens to the air in the soil? What happens to the soil life? Soil life is really important to healthy soils. The fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and other chemicals that are sprayed onto the food and soil harm this soil life. We depend on the topsoil to feed us. It's an ecosystem full of life that keeps our plants healthy and in turn keeps us healthy. Why? When our plants are healthy, they also become healthier for us to eat, offering us important nutrition. Plants need water just like we do, but some need more than others. One example is that plants that are grown annually generally need more water than perennials. Annuals, so plants that grow in 1 year, like most of our modern food crops, need more water than plants that live for many years, which are perennial. Imagine your whole life fitting into 1 year, or actually even less. In Canada, our growing season is shorter than a year because of our colder season. In a matter of months, you would change from newborn to elderly. Imagine all the growth and life changes that would happen over weeks and even days. And also imagine the nourishment, water, and resources you would need in that year. Of course, at the end of the day, some species are meant for quick growth and others not. And that goes beyond what amount of food and water is available. Now, if we step out of made-up scenarios for a second, here is a real-life example. Sudbury Shared Harvest grows many edible forest gardens. Edible forest gardens are areas that have lots of perennials, including trees and native species, that make up ecosystems that we can also eat from. These gardens only get water the first year. After that, the water they get from the rain and the soil are enough. Think of typical lawns and gardens. Could you leave them unwatered for entire summers? Would it look healthy? Usually not, but with longer-lived species and some other tips and tricks we'll chat about later, the garden is more stable and needs less help from humans to be happy. When we grow just one crop, we lose the diversity of life that naturally happens in nature. Have you ever seen one single thing grow for miles in nature? Healthy habitats have many species that live together. All these species have ways that they interact together, and that brings balance. We call this diversity of life biodiversity, and it is really important to the health of the environment. Native species and longer-lived species like perennials are also super important as they are naturally the most common species in nature. Native species have links to wildlife, as for example, milkweed is important to monarchs. Many plants and animals evolve together, creating important relationships and balance. Now imagine you grow a giant field of your favorite fruit to sell at the market. Rows and rows cover the fields around your home. One day you wake up to this oasis of your favorite fruit and you start finding your crop damaged. No problem though, only a small area was affected. But over weeks you're finding more and more fruit is affected, and a lot is getting ruined. Those critters are ruining your beautiful crop, and sometimes you'd swear they are having a great time doing it. So what happened? When we plant only one species for large areas of land, if a pest finds this crop and likes it, there's nothing separating it from the next yummy crop. It's like a giant all-you-can-eat buffet with one massive amount of their favorite food. Now, some may spray chemicals and try to kill off the damaging species, but the problem is that the pesticide may kill a bunch of other species that could help or that could offer other benefits to the garden. And now, what happens the next year when you potentially killed some of the predators of this pest species? Remember biodiversity? If we have a lot of species, we create patchworks that are way less inviting for a creature to tear through. The same applies to disease, which will have a harder time traveling if it's not all the same species and the same species are not all planted together. Some plants also help invite predator species and may help keep certain pests away. Finally, if one crop fails but you have, let's say, 35 different types of food growing, something should work out. Meaning there is much less risk of losing an entire harvest to disease or a takeover of a critter that loves your food too. Plus, if you're eating your own crops, you're going to have a lot more variety of nutrition from these different foods. That means you can feed your family while you grow your crops. Also, who wants to eat the same food over and over? And what about climate change? Many of the same things that are bad for the environment and wildlife are also not good when it comes to increasing emissions and climate change. To start, the tilling and plowing of soils releases carbon from the soil. And we don't want more carbon in the atmosphere. We would actually like less because of climate change. So far, it is estimated we have lost from 50 to 70% of the carbon in our soils. And then there is machinery. The machines used to weed, plow, cultivate, and fertilize all use precious resources. The material it takes to build these giants as well as to power them is also a downside to industrial agriculture. Creating, transporting, and using pesticides as well as fertilizers also has a considerable impact on emissions and climate change. Finally, transporting foods from large operations to grocery stores also creates emissions and pollution. The more we can grow our foods nearby, the more we limit the gas and resources needed to move our food around. Plus, less travel means less time between the harvest and us eating the food, which means more nutrients. The good news is that we can avoid these negative impacts by changing the way we see farming and by working with nature. Although changes can't be made overnight, we could move over time to different ways of farming that feed the soil, contain carbon, and create healthy environments that also feeds us nutritious food. We can all make a difference, inspire, and learn from each other. There isn't just one way to do things. There are so many ways to create great food while protecting and restoring ecosystems. Polyculture, permaculture, food forests, regenerative agriculture, silvopasture, there are a lot of options out there. It's also important to recognize the traditional knowledge involved in many of these methods. There is a lot of knowledge that comes from indigenous communities around the world that already practiced a lot of these brilliant methods of growing food long before terms like permaculture were invented. Changes can be made at a large scale and also at a personal level. How? Here are some ideas. Avoid or limit the use of large-scale machinery, tillers, pesticides, chemical fertilizers, and other chemicals that hurt ecosystems. Create walking pathways in the garden to avoid compacting soil where plants are growing. Cover soils with mulch and ground cover plants. Plant more native and perennial species. Plant species that are good at sinking carbon into the soil, like hawthorn, sumac, willow, apple, and birch. Prioritize biodiversity by planting many different species of plants. Leave some wild spaces untouched. Consider soil tests to understand your soils and its needs. Feed the soil with available nutrition like compost, manure, and biochar. Upcycle materials when possible and create closed-loop systems. That means using what we already have and building systems that don't create waste in the first place. And as individuals, what can we do? When possible, we can buy local foods and products, grow some of our own food and medicine, get to know our local farmers and how they grow food, explore different ways of growing food, learn how to make, preserve, and store food and medicine, limit food and material waste, compost foods that we cannot use, take part in community projects and gardening, create and build community to share resources, skills, projects, spaces, and build a support system. What does this mean for climate change? Let's take a look at 3 different ways making these changes can help us push back climate change. Taking out existing carbon in the air, lowering emissions at the source, creating resiliency to a changing climate. Soil actually has a bit of a superpower that most people don't know about. It is the 3rd biggest carbon sink. What is a carbon sink? Doesn't sound super exciting, but it's a really good tool to help us with climate change. A carbon sink is where carbon gets placed for a while, sometimes for short periods of time and sometimes for a very long time. That means less carbon in the air and more in the soil. Actually, more than 80% of terrestrial carbon is stored in soils. What's even better? We want more carbon in the soil because carbon-rich soil is awesome when it comes to healthy soils. Roots are also important for carbon in the soil. When plants grow, they continue to lock in more carbon into the soil. Because perennials tend to grow bigger roots than annuals, they excel at this carbon sinking. So planting more longer-lived species helps us keep more of that carbon in our soils. When we keep healthy soils with minimal disturbances like tilling, that soil can retain and continue to get more carbon. If we could increase organic matter 1% worldwide on all our agricultural soils, we could sink 256 billion tons of carbon. That is 3/4 of what we need to arrive at our 350 ppm target. This 350 ppm is the amount of carbon that is considered safe in the atmosphere, ppm meaning parts per million. On top of putting more carbon back into the soil, if we stop releasing carbon from the soil, we stop adding more carbon to the air, which brings us to other ways of lowering emissions at the source. So we know that keeping soils healthy and undisturbed stops carbon from being added to the air. But there are also other things that we can do when it comes to agriculture to limit our emissions. Like, for example, limiting use of machinery, which will also cut down on emissions from running these machines and creating them in the first place. Skipping or limiting fertilizers and other chemicals like pesticides is also something to consider. Not only is it better for the environment, making, transporting, and applying these chemicals add emissions and pollution to our atmosphere. Finally, using more of what we already have and creating better systems without waste will also help lower emissions, waste, and pollution. Making changes to build healthier ecosystems brings strength to the landscape and to the humans that live in them. And this applies to agriculture too. We can be stronger in the face of floods, drought, lack of water, changing weather, fire, insect damage, disease, and strong winds by learning from nature. Forest spaces and green spaces also help cool things down and create areas for humans and wildlife to shelter from the heat. Plus, these green spaces also help clean the air from certain chemicals and pollution. Strong local food systems help us with food security. We become less dependent on outside sources for all of our food, and we're less affected by world events because we have food nearby. We also get to build strong links with people from our community. Our planet faces many challenges, but there's a lot we can do. Together we can create beautiful, healthy spaces that bring food, safety, and community. Spaces where we can learn, share, and support each other. Want to learn more and try permaculture hands-on? We have a target to build 1 edible food forest in every ward of Sudbury. That means there is likely one near you already. We have many projects to get involved in, from planting to maintenance to harvesting. We also have free workshops and learning sessions. Get in touch and find more info on our website at sudburysharedharvest.ca.